welcome as our next presenter, Richard Shepro from Chicago. And we met about 7 years ago when you so kindly came to Cambridge, and we went out to dinner and bonded.
Yes.
Over wine and food and things intellectual as well. So I'm thrilled that you're doing this presentation and tomorrow a piece, and I'm looking forward to it. I know I won't be disappointed at all.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
As a framing conversation to prepare us for the next 2 days, I'm going to offer 3 paradigms illustrating different ways that art and science relate to each other. And we're hoping that these 3 paradigms, not centered on wine, will stimulate some group discussion about the production and appreciation of wine and help us think about the talks we'll be hearing over our 2 days together. Paradigm 1 is about the Enlightenment view that, in the French Enlightenment, that art and science are closely connected. And we'll start with this clock from 1738 that's a masterpiece of simultaneously science and decorative art. Next, we'll think about the idea of the British physicist and novelist C.P. Snow, who, beginning with a famous lecture at the University of Cambridge on May 7th, 1959, set forth the theory that we have 2 cultures in our society now, that there is what he called a gulf of mutual misapprehension between scientific thinkers on the one hand and humanist intellectuals on the other. And I'll talk about how that relates to wine. And finally, Thomas Kuhn on The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, the book that first introduced the concept of paradigm shifts in the advancement of science and other fields. This long case regulator, a grandfather clock, was built at a time when clockmaking perched right at the cutting edge of science and engineering. It was built as a collaboration between a decorative artist and what we would now call a scientist, although the concept of being a scientist didn't really come about until the 19th century. Julien Leroy was the clockmaker to Louis XV, and he was a national hero. Voltaire wrote about how Julien Leroy had bested the English in the quest to tell time more precisely. And at the time, this was the advanced technology of the day. Telling time more precisely was a key to navigational success, military success, nautical success. It was important to scientific experiments, and equally just a goal of pure science to be able to measure time more accurately. Charles Cresson, a sculptor and cabinet maker, was equally prominent at the time. The artistry of the case didn't make the clock more accurate, but science and art worked together as a powerful ideal in the Enlightenment, and Cresson was a full-fledged partner in this endeavor. At the time, scientists and politicians were debating what time was. Politicians, because the concept that there should be some kind of standardized time was just beginning. And there were questions about what clocks should actually be measuring. And so Julien Leroy designed a double movement called an equation movement for this and for a few other clocks. Because of the equations that the movement did, it could show both what was emerging as a standard time on one set of hands and pure sun time, sundial time, on a separate set of gilded hands bearing the symbol of the king's great-grandfather, Louis XIV. Julien Leroy would not have thought of himself as a scientist. That wasn't the name of any profession. Instead, there were many people important to the French Enlightenment who combined what are now considered separate professions. For example, Beaumarchais, the author of the 3 wildly successful Figaro plays, later made into operas by quite a few composers in addition to Rossini and Mozart. Beaumarchais was also an innovative experimentalist in the fields of clock and watchmaking, as well as being a spy for the king and a major funder of the American Revolution. Although the concept of Renaissance man came from the Italian Renaissance, it really flourished in the American Revolution. Benjamin Franklin, of course, was another scientist, statesman. And of course, Thomas Jefferson, in many chapters of the Commanderie, celebrated as the patron, was a scientist, inventor, and architect, as well as ambassador to France, a connoisseur, and chronicler of the wines of Bordeaux, one of the most important chroniclers, considered widely important by French historians, and ultimately a vineyard owner in his property at Monticello. And so that leads us back to wine. The development of the modern Bordeaux that the English and we often call claret coincided with the Enlightenment. Before that was a lighter wine called claret. The main building of Chateau Margaux, built about 100 years later, reflects the same blend of art and science during the First French Empire under Napoleon. The facade and the interior were built in a Napoleonic style at the height of the empire. At the end of a period of great horticultural advances, a more scientific approach to vinification, and advances in aging and bottling. The Chateau Margaux interior still today reflects the grace, detail, and majesty of the period. And the horticultural and scientific work that improved the quality of the wine worked together with the artistry and the architecture of the chateau to assure the reputation of the chateau and its wine. We can ask, we were talking last night about whether a label can affect how the wine tastes and a location, and certainly going through those entrance rooms at Chateau Margaux can't help but make the wine taste better, in my opinion. So when you visit the chateau, there's architecture, style, artisan endeavors like cooperage, and the science of their enological laboratory, all working together in Enlightenment style. A century and a half before that Chateau Margaux building was built, Dutch scientists, really engineers, drained the marshes and filled in the coast of the Medoc, using the same techniques that they'd used to reclaim and protect the land in the Netherlands. But the Dutch, already connoisseurs of French wine, as we saw in those Jan Steen paintings, and in the statistics that Henry shared with us, the Dutch also came because they knew about the nascent developments of wine in the Medoc, and some of the workers and engineers stayed to work in the vineyards or start their own vineyards. Again, art and science were working hand in hand in a way that seemed entirely natural at that time, And we can think and talk later about to what extent that's true today. My paradigm number 2 is about C.P. Snow's idea of the two cultures. Snow described a world, his world, that had gotten to the point where there were humanist intellectuals at one pole and scientists at the other. And between the two, he said that important phrase, gulf of mutual incomprehension. And he said sometimes real hostility. And he was, his views were delivered in what one might today think of as a very long, rambling style, very full of clever turns of phrase in the Oxbridge style. But in his intellectual way, he was actually quite brutal to both the scientists' view and the humanists. But in return, the humanists were quite awful to him, particularly a literary critic, F.R. Levis, who delivered what he thought would become an equally famous lecture denouncing Snow, and didn't quite work out that way. But I've condensed his long lecture and book down to 2 paragraphs by combining some of his sentences. So the 2-minute C.P. Snow. In the years since the war, he wrote, my colleagues and I have had to interview somewhere between 30 to 40,000 scientists. Now, I have no idea why they had to interview all of these scientists. I think it may have had to do with military projects particularly. But in any case, Snow wrote, we were able to find out a certain amount of what they read and thought about. I confess that I was a bit shaken. Some of the very best scientists had read everything that literary people talk about, but that's very rare. Most of the rest, when one tried to probe for what books they had read, would modestly confess, well, I've tried a bit of Dickens. It's nice to have Dickens mentioned twice before lunch. He said, that they would modestly confess, well, I've tried a bit of Dickens, rather as though Dickens were an extraordinarily esoteric, tangled, and dubiously rewarding writer, something like Rainer Maria Rilke. As for the humanists, Snow said, they give a pitying chuckle at the news of scientists who have never read a major work of English literature. Yet their own ignorance is just as startling. Once or twice I've been provoked and have asked my company how many of them could describe the second law of thermodynamics. The response was cold. Yet I was asking something which is about the scientific equivalent of, have you read a work of Shakespeare's? I now believe that if I had asked an even simpler question, such as, what do you mean by mass or acceleration, which is the scientific equivalent of saying, can you read? I would have fared no better. There's a clear parallel in my mind, as I mentioned last night, to the way different winemakers and sommeliers might talk about a wine. One sommelier might describe a wine by telling you that the maceration lasted 18 days and the pH was 3.71, or mention that there was a lot of lees stirring involved, or that it was put through a malolactic. By contrast, another sommelier in France once said to Lindsay and me of a particular vintage of Côte d'Estournel that it dances in the glass, which led us immediately to order it and to be glad that we did. I used to notice at the restaurant Le Bernardin in New York that when all the sommeliers were French, now the head sommelier is Austrian, but when they were all people who spoke French, and you'd hear them speaking French to some customers and English to others, the head sommelier seemed to give much more poetic descriptions when speaking in French and much more technical ones when speaking in English. But that seems to happen less often today. And I just thought of three young sommeliers who I think might satisfy C.P. Snow as well as F.R. Levis. Baptiste Cavagnat, shown here when he was the sommelier at Le Pyramide in the south of France, and who is now at the restaurant that only has about 6 tables of Jean-François Piège in Paris that's ironically called Le Grand Restaurant. Pascaline Lepelletier. A lot of people know about her. She is an increasingly prominent wine writer in French. She keeps winning French sommelier awards, even though she actually lives and works in New York. She wrote a book. You see, it says meilleur sommelier, masculine. She wrote a book, quite a good book that's been published in French, and I think she's trying to get it translated to English, which she could do herself, but she probably doesn't have time. But on the cover of the book, it says meilleur sommelier de la France. And it also gives that she won a separate award the same year, meilleur ouvrier de France en sommellerie. And it says ouvrière instead of ouvrier, the feminine form. She complained to the publisher that makes it sound like I won awards for being the best woman. There's a lot to that point, but the title is sommelier, but the book was published using only the feminine. So you can tell the world that she won awards that had a larger population to draw from. Laetitia. She likes to be called chef sommelier. She's at the only 3-star restaurant near Bordeaux. Where Bordeaux luminaries go for special events. Hubert de Beauvoir had his second wedding there. There's usually somebody named Muix staying at the hotel. And she's somebody I hope you all get to know at some point. So, Thomas Kuhn. Our third paradigm is about paradigm shifts. Kuhn's great work, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, it may be as important in the field of the history of science as Henry's books are in the field of art. Kuhn focuses on how ideas change. His idea was that science doesn't advance steadily, or rather, to the extent I understand him, it does advance steadily and sometimes goes off on tangents or encounters dead ends, but that it makes huge advances, the paradigm shift, when accepted ideas start to fall apart and someone or a group of people comes in with a dramatically new way to organize his or her thinking. And then there are big results. And he talks a lot about this process. He only gives 4 clear examples, so I'll just list them all at once. Lavoisier is perhaps the surprise to a lot of people. But his inclusion makes an interesting point. Lavoisier was celebrated in the French Enlightenment for discovering what makes things burn. That had been a mystery for centuries. Fire was known, but what it was unknown. Most of Lavoisier's new ideas turned out to be wrong. He thought there was a fluid that was really the transmitter of heat. But somehow his insights led others to eventually develop related ideas that led to the discovery and understanding of oxygen, which is the key to what makes things burn, and as Eric said last night, is the key to so many of the processes that we think about with wine. So how can this paradigm shift idea help us about wine? I can think of a few monumental changes in the history of wine that can be considered paradigm shifts. One is the use of sulfur. And there were, I think, 2 revolutions in how that happened. One in classical times, done by the Romans, and the other at the beginning of the 18th century in France. Another is the shift we've talked about at the end of the 17th century of red Bordeaux from being a light wine called Clairette to a deeper wine that had a capacity to age. It transformed not only what the wine was like, but the markets that would embrace it. And Haut-Brion, as I'm sure people know, became well known in England, mentioned in Samuel Pepys' diary. And this process just continued. That revolutionary period was revolutionary both in politics and in wine. Also benefited from improved glass for bottles and other developments that reduced bottle variation to a point where you could have sommeliers who would know the wines that they stocked and have a reasonable chance of having the next bottle taste a lot like the last bottle that he remembered. Before that, opening a bottle of wine was full of more surprises than we have today. Another possible paradigm shift took place in the world of champagne, where over a scant few decades, champagne changed from a light red wine to a very popular red wine. It was the favorite wine of Louis XIV by far, and it changed to the effervescent wine that we know now. I'll just talk briefly about that truly transformational shift, mention a few other candidates for paradigm shifts in wine, and then I hope we can have a discussion leading up to our grand lunch with art and wine. The most direct cause of the change was, as with most big changes in France at the time, they were connected to the Sun King, Louis XIV. And as he was the head of state, his health was of great concern. Every observation, every action he took were recorded and eventually published as the Journal of the Health of Louis XIV. And as his health began to fail toward the end of the 17th century, a war emerged among his doctors about whether he should continue to drink the light red still wine from Champagne that was the staple for him and therefore also of the court. Most of his doctors thought he should continue doing that. But one doctor, Guy Cresson-Fagon, after conducting debates in every medical college in France, he emerged victorious with his view that the king should switch from that lighter still red wine from Champagne to a bolder wine, red Burgundy. And Fagon, triumphant, became the head physician to the king for the rest of his life. He was celebrated enough that this statue of him is on display at the Musée Carnavalet in Paris. The court at Versailles switched wines too. What would one expect? And so the collapse of demand for the red wine that had made the fortunes of champagne makers occurred, but that wasn't the only factor in play. Champagne had another problem that had already been recognized, that some bottles were marred by a defect. The defect was that since it was produced in a very cold climate, the yeast would appear to have finished its work, and if the wine was bottled, or even in barrels, in the spring, the yeast would come alive again and start making bubbles, a defect. They were trying to fix that. Many scientific minds in Champagne thought about this question. The most famous of them was the monk Dom Perignon. And he made some strides, but his role was to try to suppress the bubbles. And he certainly did not say, "Come quickly, I'm drinking the stars." That first appeared in advertisements for Moet et Chandon in the late 19th century. So they got to work changing changing a bug into a feature. And by 1735, this enormous painting was made by Jean-François de Troyes. You can see it at the Château de Chantilly. You can see it at Dom Ruinart's offices in Reims, because they've made a life-size copy of this, because they believe that that's Dom Ruinart in those ice chests at the bottom. And so you can tell this is champagne and not a light red wine. The bottles have a cap that's tied on with string. The cage had not been invented, wasn't invented until 1776. I showed this picture 2 years ago in a different context at our Educateur session in LA. But this was painted as a royal commission in 1735. And that suggests that Um, um, this was not a fringe product by that time. You can see they seem to be drinking it like one might champagne. And maybe that's not so clear in that. But there they are staring at the cork. I don't know of a faster paradigm shift in the world of wine than that, which was just a matter of decades. But maybe you do, and that will emerge in our discussion. Sulfur, I've mentioned as causing a paradigm shift. Bottle glass. Then there's the question of Louis Pasteur. The fact that he's viewed as the greatest of French scientists was brought home to me during the pandemic when President Macron gave a speech attacking people who wouldn't take the vaccine. And he said, it is inconceivable to me that in the land that produced Louis Pasteur, people are refusing to, and then he went on to explain what was going on. And he was, of course, the father of microbiology and microbiological enology. So tremendously important to the wine industry. The idea of pasteurisation came from a wine idea that thankfully is not used much anymore, but it wasn't. He wasn't experimenting with milk; he was experimenting with wine. But my sense is that his work led more to incremental improvements in quality that were very important. Obviously, microbiology is the key to winemaking, but I think that's not a paradigm shift. Climate change may be, and we can talk about that. And that's my talk. But I'd welcome comments and questions and some discussion if anybody has things to say.
Bravo.
And we should use that again.
Thank you. Very nice presentation.
And people should know that's just for a recording the video and audio. So don't worry when you speak into it and
All right,
you don't
so
hear
I'll
anything
speak loud.
blaring.
Anyway.
It doesn't amplify your voice.
Can you, you, very nice vision on all of the paradigms and all of the evolutions of some of the features. Can you comment on the evolution of the cork?
That's a good question.
And the scientific piece
Yeah.
of the cork.
Others may know more than I do, but corks. Most of the corks come from Portugal, as everyone knows, and corks started in the 17th century, maybe. Anybody know?
1797 was the Lafite cork.
That was when they started having it corked for the first time. 1776 was when at the champagne maker Jackson they invented the cage, le coiffe in French. So there must have been a cork in that. Haut-Brion was in bottles in the 17th century, but I don't know what it was. Yeah. Anybody know? Henry?
I think in the late 17th century in Holland, until the late 17th century, everything was in kegs,
Mm-hmm.
in big barrels, and they would empty. You would get a glass carafe that you would buy your wine with. But I think what happened is that people started using Portuguese cork that the Dutch East India Company brought, so that they could stop the glass carafe that they produced the wine with. And I think that may be where it began, but bottles.
So it was in that period.
Yeah.
There's an interesting display about corks at the Cité du Vin in Bordeaux, where you see the difference between, for example, a Chateau Lafite cork that costs several euros, maybe like 7 or 8 euros, and that's plus inflation since I was last there, and corks that cost less than €1 that you find that are more porous. Just it's interesting to see the differences. And then, of course, there's the recent evolution of new kinds of corks, like the Diam cork, which was inspired by the problems in Burgundy of premature oxidation. And then the absence of cork, particularly in Australia and New Zealand, where corks are a rarity. People do an awful lot of experimentation with corks, trying to figure out. There are now screw caps that breathe, and I don't know that any of those are in wide use. It's a very interesting topic.
I was really interested in the painting, the big painting, because I had not seen an 18th century painting with that much drinking going on. But I attributed it to the lack of wine drinking in Watteau and all those guys, to the fact that Henry the 15th preferred hot chocolate, and there was almost no wine at Versailles because everyone drank hot chocolate, which is pretty peculiar if you think about it. But it had to be Louis the 16th that brought wine back.
The first many years of Louis XV's reign were the reign of the regent. No, it was the actual regent was the brother of was his uncle, who was called Monsieur. And he had these revels. He lived in the Palais Royal, and he had these revels, and that's where champagne actually became popular.
Oh, really? Is that what the painting is? Really?
Well, the painting's called the Déjeuner des Huîtres. There are actually two paintings. The other one is the Déjeuner au Jambon, the lunch, the ham lunch, and I'm pretty sure there's wine in that too. And they're both huge paintings. So that's interesting. But I'd noticed the absence of wine in, because I've done work on the history of pairing wine with food, and in France. And one of my first thoughts was, there's got to be a lot in art that does that, and you just don't see it. And when you do see it, it's not usually with food.
Last chance for a question.
And it doesn't have to be a question for me. It can just be your own speech.
So you mentioned Louis Pasteur's influence on wine.
Yeah.
Skip the microphone. Okay.
Oh,
Rick, first great talk. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
You mentioned Louis Pasteur's influence on wine, but I think also interesting, and I read recently about the influence of wine on Louis Pasteur because he came from the Jura region, and it's said that his observations of the wine maturing for years in barrels led him to contemplate the theory of microbiology that we, of course, know now.
that's interesting.
Vincent Souvois is what he's looking at. Just that.
Here, let's get you that's worth being on the recording.
I had read. I had read something recently along the same lines, and he is celebrated in the Jura, but which is known for the vin Souvois, which is the vin jaune, which is with the flora that sits on top of the thing. So all of that rolls together with the microbiology.
Almost like sherry, but not quite as oxidized, but an example of people and not fortified, and an example of people using oxidation as something they're trying to achieve, but in a controlled way. But there's this revolution going on in Jura with non-oxidized Chardonnay wines that's quite interesting too.
The world of wine. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great discussion.